First, I want to acknowledge that we're on the territories of the Esquimalt, Songhees, and the Sanish peoples. So I'm New Tunnel, so I'm from north of here. We're a neighboring territory, and we traditionally have protocols before entering the land. And so I live here in Victoria, and so I consider myself a settler/trespasser here on the lands, as I'm not from these lands. I am Indigenous, but I'm not Indigenous to these lands. So I just ask that we all think about what our being here means. How did we come here? Whether you live here or visiting here, what does it mean to be on these lands in theory, in reality, to the peoples here? So I just want to acknowledge that my being here contributes to the colonization and exploitations of the lands and the peoples, and that we do all our best to reimagine what our relationships could be here instead of just existing without an acknowledgement or anything beyond that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alana. And we just have a small token of appreciation for you for doing our intro for us. Thank you. And just a quick intro of us here. My name is Rance Mock. I'm the program director of the Integrate Art Society. My background is I was born in Hong Kong, where most of my family still lives. And I have been privileged enough to be on a visitor on Musqueam territory, on Algonquin territory, and now on Lekwungen territory for the past 8 years. And my work and my passion really is around how we create spaces, both more than both, physically, culturally, socially, in all forms, in our relationships, and what creating those spaces mean for how we interact with each other and how we create community in a way.
And my name is Reagan Shrum. I'm the development director of Integrate. I was born on Anishinaabe territory. I am and have been living uninvited as a settler on Lekwungen territory for about the past 10 years. I have heritage from Italy, Germany, Poland, Scotland, England. And yeah, we've been working together for 4 years? 4 years for Integrate, trying to build community, trying to look at artists in particular who maybe aren't getting other venues, and giving them paid opportunity for that.
And so this project feeds into that as well. We had our initial discussion on August 25th, and really Feedforward is about talking about the way that we share what we learn about art, how we experience art, whether that's talking to each other or writing or in art criticism. Art criticism was kind of our starting point. I think initially we had thought, it would be a great idea to have an art magazine. Whoa! But then, Franz and Chris really encouraged us to think deeper than that, to come and actually question, even beyond a magazine, what does it actually mean to put words on paper about art, and that's where this conversation and this project came forward. It's an exploration, it's a beginning. By no means are we saying that we're going to solve everything here, but we're very happy to have all of you here to gather and to talk to us about it. So we want to thank, in particular, Chris and Franz of Primary Colors, since they have provided support for us for this project. And also we have received funding from the CRD and the Canadian government, and also very thankful for local people here in the community, which includes the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, Open Space, MediaNet, Metropole, and Island Blue. I'm just checking my list. Habit, Cultured Kombucha, and Market on Yates. And housekeeping?
Yeah, for housekeeping, so we're trying to make this space a safer space as much as possible. So we have a couple guidelines, a safer spaces policy that we have printed in the front. If you'd like to see that, with Selena over there. If you at any time need anything, there's Rance and I, Selena, and Kemi, right there, Camille, right there, and we're here to help. help. If you need, these are emotional conversations or can be emotional conversations, please take time for yourself to leave if you'd like to. It won't disrupt anything. So we have two spaces. One is accessible space, one is a non-accessible space. Non-accessible space is downstairs in the garden, or there's also the Massey Gallery, which is the art sales and rental. So please take the time. Bathrooms are accessible. If you go back to the lobby, and then it'll be straight ahead. There are two universal washrooms, one with a baby changing area, and one is wheelchair accessible. Anything else? We have food set up for people. Please take it. We also have bus tickets, so if you would like, you can come after. We forgot to give bus tickets last time, so please come take bus tickets. What else? Thank you for signing media releases. Again, if you did not want to sign, that's totally fine. We do have a yellow sticker, so we don't capture you. And these recordings will be up online on our website and also through social media, perhaps?
Well, we'll share about it.
Yeah, so it's another form of accessibility in case people cannot be here at this time. Please turn off your phones if you haven't already, or silence them. Let's see, please make sure, it's not easy to share your thoughts, but please listen deeply and also acknowledge your own privileges. And so if I'm a white female, I have lots of privileges, so make sure you keep quiet and let others listen who have never spoken before. Or who have spoken lots, but it's their right to. Act from a place of care for each other, be aware of your impact. Again, prioritize Indigenous, Black, and POC speakers. And yeah, that is it.
Yeah, one small note, part of this project is we do have surveys, so if you do want to talk about art criticism with us, we have some surveys out front in paper format. We have envelopes with our addresses on it and also stamps if you want to make it easy for yourself. But we also have digital ones on our website as well, so if you want the link, let us know. And as always, in the last session, we talked about this as well. We frame this project through the 5 R's, which is relationality, reciprocity, respect, responsibility, and relevance. And these terms come from Linda Tuhiwai-Smith and Sean Wilson and other Indigenous scholars, but they came to us through Franz and Chris and Primary Colors. So we do ask you to think about these terms as we have this conversation. And Kim, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, is this one that good? Okay, thank you, Rance and Reagan, for such a warm welcome there, and thank you, Elena, as well, for the lovely land acknowledgement. And welcome, everyone. I think I recognize some people who were here for the first discussion group, or who I know, and then some people who maybe weren't at the first one. And so I think it'll be interesting today. We're going to sort of move forward from that, or keep carrying on those conversations. So my name is that a bit echoey? Is that echoey? Is that okay? My name is Kim Dhillon, and I'm an art historian and a writer. And I'm half Punjabi, but I was born in England, and then I grew up in the Okanagan. And then I've spent most of my professional career living and working in London, England. And then 2 years ago, we moved back, and I'm now a settler on Wasanich territories, and I've been practicing here as an art historian and as a writer and teaching critical theory and visual arts at UVic. And so it was very exciting when Rance and Reagan approached me originally and said, would you like to facilitate these discussion groups where we're talking about decolonization and art criticism? Because it wasn't really two things that I had considered going together before, and hadn't considered in my own practice how those might weave together. And it's been, some people might think it's a bit of a strange jump to leave central London and move to Saanich to work in contemporary art, but it's been surprisingly fruitful, and fruitful really in terms of ideas, because it's really amazing to sort of take that step back and look at things. And that's really how I've understood this project. When Rance and Reagan approached me about it, Integrates festival had been going on And then there was a need to sort of step back, maybe produce something that might be an art magazine was the original idea, and consider how documentation might be made so that the artists who were showing could use that to move forward with their careers. And then Chris and France said, do we really need that? And then this conversation began of, if it's not an art magazine, what might it be? And how have we inherited these models of writing and talking about art? And are they really functioning for the arts community here? And what else might be possible? And so that's really the starting point as to how the project came to me. And the way the structure will go today is the same as the first one went. Myself and the wonderful, eloquent, and inspirational 3 speakers next to me, who we'll introduce shortly, will sort of share a conversation for an hour, hour and a bit, and then we'll open the floor to you and welcome your thoughts and responses to that before we wrap things up. And I think just before we go to the speakers to introduce ourselves, and I'll introduce myself a little bit more about my work as well. I think where the first conversation in which Sally Yulin and Lindsay Delaron and Serena Bandar were the panelists, we were speaking very much about relationships of language to land, first languages and second languages. It kind of resulted at the end of these ideas of collective responsibility, about a relational model for criticism, and then a final sort of question as to what the differences between criticism, critique, and discourse might be. So that's sort of where, in my mind, the conversation was circling around and swimming when we finished off. And we may touch on some of those ideas, and we may go down totally different paths today, because it's a totally different group of speakers with totally different practices and experiences and cultures and perspectives. So I think we'll start with introductions. So as I say, I'm half Punjabi and half English, and I'm a settler on Wasanich territories, and I work as an art historian. And my own research is on text in contemporary practice. So I'm very interested in language and visual practice and how artists use words and what happens when we read them and what happens when we see them and those exchanges with audiences. And this project has been really interesting for me. I think the reason I originally went and worked in contemporary arts because I wanted to work with living artists, and it still rings true. Every conversation I have with an artist wakes me up and reveals to me again things, biases that I've been carrying that I don't realize that I'm carrying, and constantly make me sort of see things in new ways. And each conversation we've had in preparation for this has done that again and again, so I'm sort of excited to see where it goes today. It's not always a comfortable process, but it's a good one. And yeah, so I worked as an art critic in London for 15 years, and as a writer and as an art historian, and now I'm here, and I continue to write, but I continue to write from here, engaging in the art community here and looking at it from a different perspective than I was in London. And yeah, that's who I am. So I think we have Tarah Hogue at my far left, Alana Sayers, and Kemi Craig here today. So maybe Tarah, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Tanche, Tarah Hogue de Shinakashun. Hello, my name is Tarah Hogue. I'm here today from Vancouver, unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, where I have been living as an uninvited guest for the past 11 years, and a grateful guest. I am from the Métis Nation of Alberta originally. I grew up on the border between Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territories, which is also along an original trading route of the Métis people. I also have French-Canadian background, and my mother immigrated to the east coast of Canada from Holland when she was a teenager. So, in many ways, I have approached my practice from that nexus of immigrant, settler, and Indigenous experiences, and thinking about the very many layers that inform place. As a curator and writer, I also think a lot about the relationship between writing and curating. I came into a curatorial practice first through English and then art history, so I often begin projects thinking textually. I think textually a lot more than I do spatially, I think. Words are often my sort of, my starting place, I guess. I work at the Vancouver Art Gallery. I'm the Senior Curatorial Fellow of Indigenous Art there, and I've been there for the past 2 years. I've also been fortunate to work across a number of different kinds of spaces, artist-run, university, as well as independently as a curator. And I'm very happy to be in Victoria on these territories today, seeing lots of familiar faces. And I just want to thank Integrate and everyone for supporting me to be here. So, merci.
Thank you. Elena?
Hi, let's see if this is on. Okay, there we go, I got this. I said I'm really bad at the microphone. I always have a joke about using your big house voice instead of the microphone, so adjusting. So I'm Elena Sayers. I'm from the Hoopachesset and Alexander First Nations. That makes me Nuu-chah-nulth and Cree from Treaty 6. I grew up on the Hoopachesset Reserve in Port Alberni. If anybody's been to Tofino, you drove by my reserve and the house I grew up in. I also went to Hahopayak School, which is a native school on the neighboring Sashot Reserve. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria in the Department of English, a historically very white discipline. And I'm just starting my dissertation, and my work is always aimed at basing it on Indigenous knowledges and decentering whiteness within it. So my dissertation is going to be a mixture of art, mixed media, and writing. So if you'll see on here, there's a couple of my slides on here. I just had them at a conference at the University of British Columbia. So the blue one is my interpretation of Eden Robinson's Monkey Beach, for example. Yeah, and so the canvas has actually got pages of the actual book on there, so I'm really interested in mixing both written and turning it into a different form while having the actual pages and words. So I'm really interested in that kind of relationship, and so I really want to attempt to like decolonize / indigenize dissertation structures because the idea of writing, 200 plus page paper kills my soul. I want something that people can experience and consume and really question why we do the things we do and rely upon traditional modes of understanding when there's so many more ways, I think, to engage with knowledge to produce it and consume it. And actually part of this stems from, as part of the Indigenous curators who did an exhibit, was that about a year ago? Yeah. Oh my goodness, it's been 2 years, where I had all Nuu-chah-nulth pieces and I asked people to consider them as chapters of my dissertation and how they might interpret that differently if they looked at that, because to me these prints had a lot of knowledge and culture embedded within them. So to really question why we prioritize the written word over other forms of knowledge. And that's pretty much me.
Thank you. Kemi.
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Kemi Craig, and I use she and her pronouns. I was raised between the Cherokee and Catawba territories, which you would know as North and South Carolina, the mountains of North Carolina and the foothills of South Carolina. I came to Lekwungen and West Saanich territories in 2002 as a settler, and I use the term settler very purposefully because while my ancestors were brought to Turtle Island against their will, my ancestors that I know of are also from the same territories in what we know as South Carolina for 6 to 7 generations. So when I came to BC as a settler, I came here of my own volition. I also came here cognizant of a history of people of African descent being invited from the US to BC to be kind of, barriers is the word that's coming to me right now, but a way to uphold colonization and the taking of indigenous land. So I understand that some people of African descent use the term like being displaced, but I want to very purposefully use the term settler. I have a practice that kind of navigates between imagery and movement. I am very much interested in the images used in film and video, particularly Super 8 film, and the ways that there exists a space of creating narratives with the imagery, and the narratives that create a space of possibility using different interpretations and our ways of knowing and seeing. I also have a movement practice. I've worked with a few performance artists since I've been in Canada, Justine Chambers, as well as Brendan Fernandez here at the gallery. And I definitely enjoy what people understand as dance and performance, but the work that I'm speaking to is more gestural in its articulation and more exploring the power and the choreography and the why of the movements that emerge from my body and in relationship to other people and the land. I'm very much interested in Afrofuturism and futures in terms of indigenous resurgence and decolonizing work. But in that work, I also am very much interested in not moving beyond the conversation of reckoning with the past. And I guess we'll speak more to that coming up, but
okay.
yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, all three of you. I think, yeah, well, let's speak more to that. So I think you can already see the great richness in the speakers in terms of practices, cultural backgrounds, how we've all arrived here, how we approach that through our work. So the initial question behind this Feed Forward series was around art criticism. And when I conceptualized that when it was initially brought to me, I was thinking of art criticism in a fairly standard format, the printed word in a magazine, critiquing and reviewing visual work. That was the kind of limited linear space in which I was kind of picturing it. So I wonder if we could each start. I think it's a question I'll put to all of you. So maybe we'll just go to Tarah first. Maybe we'll just work down the line. We'll mix it up as we go. But if you each want to respond to the relevance of art criticism to you in your practice. And there was a comment at the end of the first session on maybe we don't need art criticism, but we need arts criticisms in the plural. So if you want to maybe reflect on that, and so we can get the ball rolling there on what is the relevance of art criticism or arts criticisms to each of you in your practice. Tarah.
Okay. I mean, I appreciate that you draw attention to the need for plurality, and maybe multivocality is something that we can talk about. Because, I mean, the foundation of arts criticism is connected to ideas of rationalism and judgment, and is very much connected to the Eurocentric models that we're trying to decolonize. So and also I think we have to recognize that art itself is entangled with this history. And so if we're going to envision something alternate, we have to also envision what arts are in that context, right? But that being said, both from the perspective of being a curator as well as being a writer, someone who has engaged in something like arts criticism, although I would never call myself a critic, the value of criticism for me, and I use that word broadly with some hesitation, is the idea of feedback, riffing on the title of this series. I appreciate reading what other people are seeing within the work that I'm doing. What is evident to a visitor to an exhibition, let's say. And because when you're working on a project, of course, you're so in it and so deep into it that often when you present something, you're not really sure by that point, especially what's coming across. Often it takes much more time for things to unfold before you are able to reflect upon them and, at least for me, not feel anxious as shit about it. Excuse the language. And then as a writer, I think that this is my way of thinking through something, of thinking about what an artwork is doing, why I think that it has a relevance to the world now, or for me personally. And I think that ideally this is a space that allows us to grow in our practices, that pushes the conversations forward, so to speak. So that's where I would start.
Okay, thank you. Alana, it's the relevance of art criticism or arts criticism to you, or if there is a relevance?
Right, awesome. So as I said, my background is in literature. So one of the questions I'm looking at my dissertation is what is Indigenous literature? Looking at it from what is Indigenous and then what is Indigenous literature when you put them together. Because to me, there's so many things that I think could fall under the definition of literature, such as painting, such as other different things. And so to me, it's how are we defining that word and why? Are we limiting what could be taken into consideration? Are we taking some more traditional forms and placing them within a context that they maybe shouldn't belong in? Or, and who's making those decisions is what I'm looking at. So when I look at Indigenous literature, I think, well, why are we trying to create an Indigenous literary criticism, for one? Do we want our stories and the things that we're creating to be considered literature and then have to fall under these hierarchies of classification of what's good, what's not, and all of these different things, right? Because you can kind of already see the field taking shape as that, excuse me, with regards to who's being published and things like that, and who's being widely read in classrooms across the country and who is not, and looking at those things. So for me, there's not really a lot of enough discussion around why we're doing it, because to me, indigenizing something, it would be, instead of decolonizing something that already exists and using a Western form, I guess maybe to achieve legitimacy would be what can we create instead? What kind of space that we can open up to create a different kind of community, a different kind of interaction with the things that we create, and maybe not needing to rely on classifications like we traditionally have. Instead, what could we create in that place? So that's kind of where I'm at and my work is at, and what it's looking at with regards to arts and literary criticism is this what we want for our artists and all the things that we're creating?
Thank you. Kemi.
Thank you. I think when we were talking earlier and you were asking about art criticism, and you mentioned that in the last circle that you had, you also spoke about maybe there's a different way of looking at art criticism. And I feel like if we step away from the way that art criticism has traditionally been used. And in my mind, I think of the value of bearing witness to artwork, and there's a value in being a critical spectator in that space of critical spectatorship. I actually need that feedback as a part of the work, like it's an integral part of it, because that space of being conscious of the narratives that we create every day and looking at work and then providing that lens to a work. Like if you have a particular relationship to something that you're bearing witness to, questioning why that is. What are the larger institutions at play? What is it that has given you the lens that you have that allows you to see what you're looking at or experience what you're looking at in a particular set of ways? So I think if we can look at it more as an activated space where we're creating new possibilities as opposed to deconstructing something and then not constructing something, like adding value to it, adding a richness in the conversation. I think if we can include ourselves in the conversation of spectatorship and our relationship to work, then it can have value. And to me is quite important.
Okay, so I might come back to you then. We'll go down this way for the sort of follow-up of that question, because I think you kind of lead into it nicely there. And the question is, what is the responsibility of the critic? And I suppose we could read that in terms of the responsibility both to the artist or the curator, but also a responsibility to the audience. Yeah, so would you like to respond to that following on?
I guess I don't have like one particular way to say that, like a prescription for a way that an audience should interact with work. But I feel like if we are continually unpacking who we are and our responses to artwork, our responses to performance, our ideas around what makes art and what do we not perceive as art, or what questioning what are the things that we value in particular work or performance, and why is it that we don't value other aspects. That I almost see the audience as a co-collaborator or another writer, for lack of a better term. Like you are the other part of that relationship, because like the work obviously does not exist on its own in a vacuum. Like you, how do I put it? I think what I'm just trying to tease out is our role in actively seeing ourselves in the work. Like that it's not something that's just outside of ourselves, that someone else made, but we are embedded in that as well. And then to always ask ourselves, like, what are the ways that we're embedded in that? Does that make sense?
It does. It
Okay.
does make sense. Okay, Elena, do you want to respond?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great way to look at that, because I think that's what was missing from what I said, is that, these pieces that are being created, they can't just exist on their own, right? It requires engagement from the artists, from critics, from, curators and the audience, right? And so, I think maybe what should be being looked at then is, I really like the word that you used, relationship, is the relationship. So to me, relationships, they need to be watered, they need to be nurtured so that they can grow, there needs to be work that needs to be done. So how can we continue to learn how to best be in those kinds of relationships, So like as an Indigenous person, for example, there's a lot of cultural appropriation and things that happen. So how can we as artists be able to put our work out there without it being vulnerable to that, right? So how can we begin to work with audiences to be able to engage with the work in a different way that allows it to be engaged with differently, and then what you do with that. So for example, like as well with in academia, one of the things I'm writing an article about is about using the logics of doctrine of discovery. So as Indigenous people as well, not kind of going and taking other ideas without credit, which I think is one of the things that, we always need to be self-aware of what's going on in our own field that we're critiquing in others, right? So yeah, I absolutely think that that's a really good way to look at it, is that it is a relationship, and that it is really important to be able to look at all of these things and how we engage with one another and how we can continue to learn to be in those processes better. And for me too, in this era of reconciliation and all the reconciliation discourses, it's people need to take that on themselves as individuals, as organizations. How can we actually begin to take action instead of just using them as key buzzwords, but what's the action we can take? So I think that begins now, within arts and literary criticisms, is what can I do to, engage with art and critics in ways that I want people to engage with my work. Something to that effect, I think.
Thank you. Tarah, do you want to respond? So the responsibility?
Yeah, I think maybe building on what you were saying about how ideas circulate and being aware of what's in the field that we're working within. I've been brushing up on my Canadian art history recently. And I think that this example speaks volumes about the way that histories are built and told and reproduced. And I'm a total noob when I talk about this kind of Canadian art history. So anyone that's an actual art historian will be like, well, yeah, duh. But for me, it's really illustrative. So Eric Brown was the first director-curator of the National Gallery of Canada. And in the mid to late 1900s, he organized exhibitions of the Group of Seven's work in England and then in France. And prior to the exhibition's opening, he published journal articles about the Group of Seven's work and how it was exemplary of a new national art from Canada. He also arranged for critics to come over from England to Canada to view the Group of Seven's work here. So essentially, prior to the exhibition opening, critics in both England and France were made aware of what the narrative should be, what Eric Brown's narrative of Canadian national art is. And to a large extent, that narrative is the one that has been reproduced about the vast, empty wilderness that is Canada. Although, it's also interesting that the way that his ideas about the Group of Seven's work was taken up in relationship to both English and French nationalisms in very different ways, in terms of ideas about primitivism or landscape art in England. So I think the responsibility of art criticism is to be well-researched in terms of thinking about how we're embedded, and to not continually replicate the same narratives, but to think about other ways of how we can engage with the work. You know, why can't art criticism be poetry, for example?
Thank you. Okay, there's lots in there I want to respond to, but I think we'll keep moving and we'll see how we go. Okay, so we've kind of started to get a sense of all of your practices and your positions on the relevance of criticism and how it feeds into or doesn't feed into your own practice. So what I'd like to do is take some time to talk about each of your practices in a bit more detail, and specific projects, and then see what responses we get between that. So Elena, we haven't started with you yet, so I think, should we start with you? And perhaps you lead, but maybe talk about your dissertation and the difference between the visual and the verbal, but if you feel there's a different project that's more relevant that you'd like to respond to, then please do.
Okay. So I'm an artist first and foremost. I just ended up as an academic. And so I think that's why, I approach the field the way that I do, is, and actually within Indigenous literature, there are a large number of writers who then went on to write literary criticism. And I think that, really talks about a lot of the nature of the field and the relationships within that field. Excuse me. So as I mentioned, I'm from the coast here, and a lot of Indigenous scholarship is very much land-based. It's land-based and usually treaty-based. So in Newtonalth, we do have a modern-day treaty, which my nation isn't a part of. So as I mentioned, my work looks at the conceptions of indigeneity. So in Canada, we have the Indian Act, which is very unique to Canada, and it defines what a race is. It's one of the only countries in the world that has such an act. Excuse me. And so anyways, I bring that up because there's different forms of what being an Indian means. So according to the Indian Act, that's very specific, but Aboriginal and Indigenous within the country means Métis, Inuit, and Indian. So within Indian and Indigenous, it can mean very different things. Anyways, so I am a status Indian, and now within Newtonalth, we have new treaty Indians, which are very different from status Indians now. So there's also like the Nishka and the Sawasan, who also have modern-day treaties. Those each have individual treaty rights now that are different from the numbered treaty rights and status Indian rights. Excuse me. So I'm looking at the complexity of indigeneity. So even when using Indigenous sources, there's such a complexity of indigeneity. And what I really want to do is bring to light and a visual of those complexities. So that's why I turn to getting off the page, because I find the page to be very limiting. And so much of what I know has been, what I've been taught via relationships, and you can't cite those. You need actual, scholarly sources. So through art, I think it allows me to be able to bring in those things and allows me to reveal the different layers that exist. So in another one of the slides, you'll see it's very brightly colored. I call that one Indigenous poetry. So it has a bunch of poets from Indigenous writers. And to me, I call it a volcano circuit board. It's kind of what it turned out to be. And I have it there because it really wants me to question people, what is Indigenous poetry? Because you have a poet in there, his name's Jordan Abel. He's a Nishka writer, and his poetry is, it's an interesting to watch the way that people are engaging with it, because people are asking, is it visual arts? Is it Indigenous studies? Where does it fit, right? Which ties into the larger thing of what I am doing. So I'm trying to look at things from a coastal, non-treaty-based perspective, which is a very important distinction, especially now that Indigenous conversations have turned from being within a country to a larger trans-Indigenous conversation. So that's Indigenous people from around the world. So to me, what I'm trying to create is a way to study literature based from that, based from being a non-treaty coastal nation where a large part of our territory goes out into the water, and what I can bring to conversations about that, excuse me, including the way that we create and study art and the way that it's perceived. So how can it begin to have conversations in the ways that we all, including other Indigenous peoples, look at why we do the things we do, right? Because as we know, colonialism is very complex, both in lived realities and theoretically. And so to me, it's just trying to bring this web of things to something visual that we can all look at and engage from. Because my piece is, I always say that I want people to feel something as opposed to think something, and to take that away from that. So I think that's where I'll leave things at, is it's just trying to create a very different approach, both within Indigenous circles as well as non-Indigenous circles, with regards to looking at literature and art.
Thank you. Okay, so much to think about in there. Who would like to dig a little bit into their own practice next? Kemi or Tarah? Kemi. Would you like to? Tell us more. I volunteered. Tarah gestured to you, and gesture is important in your practice. So on that, can you tell us specifics about your work? And maybe we'll start with the word gesture. Yeah.
So maybe in starting with the word gesture, I'll speak a little bit to my movement practice first. The first time I was able to perform gesture in a very deliberate way was when I was invited to work with Justine Chambers, who's a contemporary dancer that lives in Vancouver, and she wanted to do a project that she called choreography work, where she wanted to activate different spaces in the streets and in public in Victoria. And she invited a number of choreographers, myself included, to create a work choosing any space on this map that ran around downtown downtown Victoria. And for my offering, it was a choreography that was comprised of a collection of gestures that I noticed myself doing every day when trying to get around other people. Or to word it differently, what I was doing was creating space for other people. So I noticed that I was continuously getting out of the way of other people, and I was kind of performing these same movements over and over and over. And so the location that I chose to do it on was Fort Street. So for me, there was an interesting tension of performing the choreography in the middle of the street, where obviously I am blocking and I am disrupting and I am taking up space, but the movement was this collection of gestures of always trying to give someone else the right of way. In the last project that I participated in, it was for Imprint. That was a show that was put together through the Intercultural Association, Greater Victoria. And I'd been taking a choreography class for emerging choreographers, where we were asked to put together solos, and I really wanted to work with this spoken word artist. And so for that, I would listen to the words of this artist that also talked about, she's also of African descent, and she, in her poem, talks about trying to be soft, trying to, as a way of survival, not come across as aggressive or too powerful or too much, so that you did not cause a reaction in someone else that could be dangerous to you. And so in creating that choreography, it was about listening to the words, but also moving, sitting in my body and moving in the slowest way that I could possibly move in order to allow a softness to emerge and a fluidity to emerge that for me was very related to my identity and the way that I move about the world. But it also takes a certain amount of power and control in order to move that way, in order to sustain a gesture or a movement or an extension. In my film and video practice, I preferred to work with analog film because I really like working with the material of film. And I kind of got a lot of critique, or I got a lot of feedback when I was in graduate school. They were like, why are you working in this? I think it was read as being nostalgic. And, you know, the question was like, why are you working in Super 8 when you could work in video? Eventually, you're going to have to learn to work in this other medium. This is not sustainable. Why are you drawn to that? But in working with in working through that and questioning that, I realized that a part of that experience was both that even though I was creating imagery in the here and now, because of the film, the way that film quality reads, it looks like something that is set before. So it was kind of a way of embedding myself and my experience in history, but through a contemporary articulation and contemporary images. And also, there was something that was very important to me with seeing the scratches on the film and seeing that even when you're watching a video, for example, because I would transfer it to video sometimes, and sometimes I'd play it with a projector. But when I transferred it to video, even though you're watching something that was made recently, there's evidence of these markings on the film that I felt were very important to me when I talk about simultaneous experiences or the simultaneity of experiences, like that though I am expressing joy and elation, I am not negating the trauma in my experience as well, and the trauma of my ancestors, but also the joy that's in my body. And so I kind of like film in its ability to almost be in multiple places at once. And when I use video, I prefer to use things like a cell phone or something that is readily available to anyone, in part because when I started using a bit of digital imagery in my practice, it was very heightened what was happening with police brutality in the US, and I remember, it's not that it doesn't happen here, so I don't want to by any means say that the experiences here are not that Canada somehow gets a pass. I don't want to. But I think being from the States and my family, my entire family still being there, with the exception of my daughter and I being here, I was very much, I don't even know how to articulate it. I was very much in a place of feeling something that I could not ignore, and I remember seeing different footage from cell phones and seeing how it didn't make a difference in terms of justice being brought about, but on the other hand, that it made a difference in terms of the articulating like the multiple experiences of what was happening, that awareness was becoming more pronounced. And there was a relationship for me between cell phones and also Super 8 cameras, in that it was one of the Super 8 cameras in particular were one of the first opportunities for everyday people or anyone to have access to a camera. Before, like the 35mm camera was just, it was too heavy. The 16mm camera also not as accessible. So when you have the people that are producing cultural knowledge, there are people with means, mostly white people and also mostly people of the upper class. But Super 8 camera created a shift in that. And I also felt that shift with cell phone cameras. And so that's why in my work, one of the clips you'll see projections on a plinth of images that are taken from cell phones as well as Super 8 images. And in addition to that, I will create soundscapes, sometimes from people seeing an image that I provided them with, and then them telling me what their interpretation of that image is, and then creating multiple voices that are layered. But in that instance, with the plinth, the soundscape are different sounds that were taken from the internet, which are some of the altercations that happened with police officers and people that were being assaulted by officers. So I don't know.
It's all fascinating. Before we go on to Tarah's practice, do either of you want to respond? Does it prompt anything? Do you want to respond to anything in Kemi's practice or in Elena's? Or I have one brief question. Sure. The relationship in your practice between the dance, the performative, the gestural work, and the filmic, video-based work, do you see them as two separate components in your practice, or two integrated components? I just wondered if you could sort of nuance the relationship between the two.
Sure. I feel like the relationship between the practices is more embedded in the process of creating it. Creating any type of work. I prefer to work without a particular plan. This idea of having an outcome and arriving at a particular point, for me, that's a very colonial approach to me doing work. I like to have a certain amount of ambiguity, and I also like to create an opening where I don't necessarily know, but I trust that what needs to emerge will emerge by being in motion, by creating. Sometimes when I go out with, usually when I go out with the camera, I don't exactly know what I will film, but I take the tools with me, and I kind of put myself in places that I guess create a certain condition, and then when I'm in that space, I know when it's time to turn the camera on, and I know what it is I want to shoot. And then often I'll just store the images for a while, and then come back to them. It's almost like creating a body of archives. And I can do that with movement too. I may turn a camera on, film myself doing something, and then come back to it. I very much want to, I think because there's so much of a gap between the knowledge that I hold and the knowledge of my ancestors. There's a gap there, and I think one of the reasons that I like to create a space of something emerging is that that's where I'm hoping the speaking and the knowledge comes through. Like by trusting this thing that I don't necessarily have an intellectual awareness of, but if I create the conditions that the thing that needs to emerge will emerge. And I recognize that I'm moving a lot as I'm.
Thank you. Okay, Tarah, can you tell us more about your practice? And I think it was in particular the exhibition, How Do You Carry the Land, that you wanted to talk to us about.
Yeah. So, I mean, as a curator, I think you're always working responsively, being responsive to the site, the history of that is contained within that place. I don't know. I shouldn't say you, because this is how I'm working. And also, I think my way of working is very much informed by the fact that, you know, my entire professional life has been lived on lands that are not my own, and as a Métis person that wasn't raised in Métis culture, I'm very much interested in what the shared space of the Indigenous is, and because that is a space that has nurtured me so much, and I think now I find myself in a place, you know, over the past couple of years where I work in an institution that serves a very large audience, a very diverse audience, although not always so diverse also. And that's a very fraught space to inhabit. And I feel like as a curator, I'm pretty much continually inhabiting fraught spaces and trying to unsettle what the experience of those spaces is, or to bring attention to the things that are not visible within art spaces in particular. So my first exhibition at the Vancouver Art Gallery was called How Do You Carry the Land? And it was a collaboration with Ayumi Goto and Peter Morin, who have had a collaborative performance practice since 2013. Ayumi is a Japanese diasporic woman. Peter is a Tahltan First Nations man, and they work toward opening space for, again, for multivocality, I think. For opening space for their ancestors to meet and to work together, for their mothers to meet and to visit with each other, and thinking about what that cross-ancestral relationship building process is. They specifically don't use the term cross-cultural in their work, which I think is interesting because it opens things up a little bit more. So in working with Ayumi and Peter at the gallery, you know, number one, as a performance practice, how do you, in a museum kind of setting, not close that practice down through like only representing documentation in the gallery, for example. So that was one of the main considerations in approaching the exhibition. And so we sort of tried to think about the space as a body, and to interweave their practices as individual artists as well as collaborators throughout the space. And so we did live performance in the exhibition during the course of its run, and they invited me to perform with them. So we were sort of breaking the normative roles that curators and artists generally inhabit, well, more the curator than anything, by performing together. We also closed the gallery to the public during open hours so that we could tour our mothers through the exhibition together with some other family members. And that was, since Ayumi and Peter had first started collaborating, that was in 2013. That was the first time that their mothers actually did meet. So it was a big moment for them, and I was really really grateful that they opened that space for myself and my mom as well. So just all of the kinds of activities around the exhibition were so different in character than the kind of programming that often happens in that space. And in terms of writing around the exhibition, I mean, that's such a big challenge in this kind of setting, is how do you communicate the ideas around the exhibition to the audience that's coming to the very diverse but not so diverse audience. And we approach that through asking the audience a series of questions, starting with the title of the exhibition, how do you carry the land, to attempt, and I don't actually know what the experience of someone visiting the exhibition would be in relationship to what I hope it would be, so, but attempt to encourage people to slow down by posing a question directly to them. How do you carry the land? How could you be changed by this encounter? And trying to really destabilize that singular objective voice that we often encounter in exhibitions and in museums as well. So it was a really great first experience working in the museum, and a very different set of challenges than what I have encountered in my practice independently, because all of a sudden, because I'm in this fraught position of working in the institution now, that is my job. It's a very different kind of experience than working independently or collaborating with other Indigenous curators and being contracted by other institutions, let's say, because the whole framework is I'm much more embedded within it, I guess. So, yeah.
Okay, so I'm really intrigued by the tour of the mothers and the mothers meeting, and for a whole bunch of reasons, so I might ask you to follow up on that a little bit more. Like, I think coming from a sort of curatorial background, the idea of closing the gallery to the public, to sort of, in terms of arts funding and whatnot, limiting the access, right, and closing the numbers of people that could come through the door, but then prioritizing the kind of quality and the specific relationship of the people who you're going through the space with is fascinating. And yeah, so the idea of sort of quality over quantity of footpath and intimacy over a sort of broader audience or something, as it were. So maybe can you just tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, well, I think also to sort of add on to what you were saying is really thinking about whose knowledge is valued in these places. And both Peter and Ayumi consult with their mothers on everything that they make. As someone that is thoroughly grounded in a tall 10 worldview, that is because of his mother, right? And one of the pieces in the exhibition that Ayumi made, a performance called In Sonorous Shadows of Nishu, there's a series of written texts accompanying these watercolor paintings that she did after she ran each day. It was a running-based performance. Ayumi loves to run, so a lot of her performances involve running, and she would journal to her mother in Japanese. And I think, in terms of, so it's really just about honoring that, honoring their knowledge in this space where their knowledge so often doesn't count. Peter has called his mom the curator of Tahltan knowledge within their family. So I think it's just, being who I am, I feel very much that these spaces can shift. I think that these spaces can change. I'm invested in thinking and trying to do that because I've experienced it through this work and through the work of others.
Okay, and then I want to, I think I'm going to put a question to everyone, but I think I might come back to you because you mentioned multivocality in your first answer there, and then the idea of Ayumi journaling in Japanese. And I want to ask a question about legibility. So I think as a curator, you might approach that perhaps differently than Kemi and Elena might as artists. So I'm sort of thinking about how you and do you consider legibility and translation of ideas to audiences? What audiences do you have in mind when putting forward the work? Is there, what multitudes of audiences are there? Is there even a hierarchy or such there? How do you consider making ideas that may be specific to a cultural context or even an individual legible to an audience? And how might that be different, showing work that is maybe specific to a cultural context within Canada, to an audience in Canada, or showing it internationally? So I'm kind of just thinking around ideas of legibility and translation of the work to an audience.
Yeah, this is something that I struggle with so much because I want to be generous, first and foremost. I don't think that everything that I do needs to be legible to everyone. And one of the ways that I've come up against this recently, this issue of legibility, is around this indigenous concept of the Great Ocean as an alternate naming to the Pacific. And without explaining the whole framework of the Great Ocean and why we would maybe take up an alternate concept to the Pacific, without that framework, it's not legible, right? Necessarily to someone that has not been introduced to this idea before. But so how much framework do you want or should you give to the audience, let's say? And that's something that I've been struggling with for practical reasons because of things like word counts in exhibition didactics, which is a real problem. But also, there's, when do we just do the work the way that we want to, even if we're in spaces where not everyone is going to be on the same page as us, right? So in particular with this project that I'm working on now, which is with a group of 4 other Indigenous curators who are from around the Pacific, we felt very strongly that we didn't want to explain the term Great Ocean. We just wanted to use it, to inhabit it, and hopefully people will glean some of the meaning from the larger context. So yeah, I don't know if that's so much about legibility directly as much as maybe translation, but I think those are really intertwined concepts.
Thank you. Do you know what I'm wondering as I say it? Like, I don't know the root of the word. Like, does the root of the word legibility, is it locked into write? Like, is it tied into the idea of the written? I don't, because I'm thinking of like ledger, you know, I'm thinking of like the physical written. So I don't even know if even asking the question about legibility, there's almost a direct association to an idea of a written translation. It may not be, because I don't have Google in front of me and I don't know the root of the word. So, okay, so Elena, what about this idea of legibility to you, or translation, maybe both of them?
Right. I think that's a good question. Like, who, it's access, right? So, legibility, it's what is that to who, right? And I think there's a difference between accessibility and, legibility, and Native writer Eden Robinson, she has this really great book called something to do with Sasquatch. Anyways, it's in there. She talks about that she always is conscious of what she uses from her own culture in her books that are going to be, read by the public. And so she calls it Heisla copyright. So she says, she has to get permission of her community and her aunts to see what she's able to use and to not use, So I think that there's different people who have different processes that they use to decide what is and isn't okay to share, right? And so I think that for me, like with the prints in the gallery here, I didn't explain them. To me, I was able to identify certain things within the photos to understand that, because I come from a Nuu-chah-nulth-based place. And in my work as well, there's a lot of things that I just don't explain. I don't allow people to catch up. I provide them with the resources to be able to do the work, to be able to understand certain areas. But to me, there's always going to be parts of my work that not everybody gets to know. Whether it's that you're Indigenous, whether it's you're from my nation, or, whatever it is. To me, it's about deciding on access, and it goes back to responsibility of what are you going to do with that work? What, beyond that, it's going to be presented to you, you're going to hold it in your hands, and then what? So to me, that's kind of, I guess, just where I come at it as is, do we get to know? And to me, that's a colonial understanding that we get to always have all the answers and that everything is available to us. When to me, it's not, that there should be certain boundaries that are respected and that it should be a normalized part of consumption of art and literature, I guess.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Okay, Kemi?
I guess when you were speaking about legibility, the first thing that came to mind was how, as a person or as an artist, playing with the awareness that there are going to be multiple ways of reading work, or multiple ways that what you're presenting is being interpreted. So with the idea of legibility, and I think that there's a really powerful space there, and that if you leave enough room, there is space for people to have multiple readings of the same work. And also just kind of agreeing that it is not up to one person to create something that reads in a particular way to everyone, because in a way that would be impossible, because as we're reading something or understanding something or interpreting, our experiences and our lenses are so much a part of that, that we can't hold that for everyone, nor should we have to. But also that in that place of unknowing, if something isn't quite legible in the way that we we think it could be, that there's also like a really powerful space there. So,
Yeah, it's because my own sort of like reason for working in art, and because I actually came from like a political science background, and then I just found it too didactic and too depressing, and so I quickly moved into art history. And it's the potential of art as a catalyst for dialogue and potentially for change that's sort of is what's sort of at the root of my passion for continuing to work in art. I wonder, Rance, how are we? What time do you want to move to questions? How are we doing for time? It's 2:40. Do you want me to move to the kind of final question before we open to the floor? Are we doing okay?
Sure, I think we're doing good.
Okay. How's everyone doing? Is everyone comfortable? Okay. So I think, I've written a few things down that you guys have been saying throughout. So, because there seems to be a lot of resonances between your practices, despite the different backgrounds from which you come, despite that you're working in performance and in an English department and in curatorial practices, despite all these differences, there seems to be a lot of resonances between what you're doing. So I have to read my own handwriting here, which is particularly horrific. So, Elena, you said at the start that you're interested in questioning the prioritizing of the written over the visual. Kemi, you said you're interested in narratives of possibility within your work, and Tarah, you said that you approach your curatorial practice thinking textually rather than spatially. So this idea of narratives, of text, of the relationship of the written seems to resonate between all of your practices. And then I think each of you have sort of touched upon futurisms or possibilities or imaginings or reimaginings. I think what can we create instead? Elena said reimagining our relationships. I think Elena also said, and destabilizing the voice, the singular voice. That's what my writing says. Destabilizing the singular voice. So with all of that in mind, with these kind of questionings of the relevance of the written, the role of the written, of imagining what might be possible, I'd like to ask each of you to sort of respond to this question that this project originally was kind of, once we moved away from this kind of more straightforward question of can we decolonize art criticism, we began in our research moving towards this broader question of and we were trying to think of things in a sort of non-linear consideration of time, like a bit more of a kind of globular span of time rather than an A to B, and we're here on the line. So if the European model didn't exist, if that wasn't the dominant form, what else might be possible? What other ways might there be in that we could communicate and discuss and respond and critique artwork across all of its forms that moves away from that model and towards something else that resonates with all of these elements of your practice? So I think I'll put that question to each of you now. So what might the model, if it didn't come from this Eurocentric model, if that never existed, what else might be possible? What might it look like? And as remembering as well that our brief here today is not to come out with a manifesto for a podcast or something, that we're being much more sort of open-ended in possibility and less rigid in endpoint. So I think Kemi, because you're next to me, I'm going to go to you first, and we'll.
I hope she doesn't start with.
Oh, okay. Are you? Do you want me not to start with you? Okay, Elena. Okay, if you're still processing, Elena looks ready to go. So she's ready to jump right in. So we'll go to Elena first.
Okay, great. Well, I think to me, imagining like a decolonized future begins with all of us and the work, right? Because all of us, including myself, all have different amounts and different ways of work that we have to do to be able to attempt that in our lives and in the things that we do, even in this space. I think that, they've done a really good job here of creating a really great space to allow these conversations to kind of happen organically. There was, I feel like, enough of a structure, but not once that was forced to do that. So I think even just the way that we get together and talk about things, that even that can be changed. So things like that we can all take up in our hands today, and work that we can do now to start to create these futures, and if not at least lay the foundations for that. So I think, decolonization and work is all of us. It's sitting here in front of us, and we have to pick it up and do something with it. And so I know for me, for example, in literature, I read a novel and I'll be like, oh, I didn't like that, or oh, this was so good. And I have to question myself in why. Why was it good? Why didn't I like it, right? Like, is that kind of like my Euro-Western training, through the way that I've been educated, that's helping me to critique it that way? Or, what is it that's behind the way that I'm interpreting this book? Or is it just how it made me feel? So why is that? For me, it's questioning myself in the way that I consume that art. And so then, it leads me to ask myself, well, what is it that I want from this text and why, right? So it's just really questioning my motives and what's my responsibility to it, this piece of art that somebody's put out there for us to consume. And then what do I do with it? So in my dissertation, I was kind of struggling between being like, oh, I'm going to include this in here because I thought it was horrible, and I'm going to include this because I love this, right? And so I feel like, am I just reproducing some of these binaries that exist, and why? So for me, that's one of the ways that I take up decolonization. My own work is just holding my own self responsible for the ways, and that be bringing in that awareness of why I'm doing the things that I'm doing, or being able to be conscious and provide an explanation for the awareness of why I'm choosing to do something differently. For example, so even in my own department, I'm going to be their first native to graduate with a PhD in their department. So you can imagine that that's taken a lot of work to be able to do. So to me, that's also decolonization work, right? There's all of these things that, need to be able to do that to happen. So for me, it's trying to create the future now, right? Being able to figure out what kind of work that I can do, what can I take on while balancing all of these other things in my life, right? And so I think that's going to look different for each of us. And then how do we embody that? Because, it's emotional work, it's mental work, it can sometimes be physical work, so how can we take that on, support each other in it, and be able to create spaces where we can sit down and have conversations, because there's no clear map on what that looks like or how it's done, and be able to learn to interact and be with each other differently. Excuse me. I think I'm done. I'm good.
Okay, Kemi?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
I guess I would say, maybe I'll put forth a few kind of keywords that come to mind when I think about what a model could look like. And I think about my own practice or contribution, or the word relationship comes to mind. This isn't really a word, but more of a phrase, like this idea of collapsing a notion of linear time and recognizing that it's more like being folded in on itself, so that it's being this idea of past, present, future, that they're all experienced at once. And I think the idea of multiple truths, multiple experiences, multiple voices, if we can hold that in whatever model we create, I think that would be moving us towards both a future that is desirable, but also I think I want to acknowledge that a lot of these concepts are already here, they're already in place, and it's just that other ideas have been privileged over these ideas. You know what I mean? The things that we're talking about, they're not new. Charles, that's in the room, we did he allowed me to interview him for a podcast that was on Afrofuturism, and we were talking about the relationship between indigenous futurisms, Afrofuturism, and indigenous resurgence, and reason being, the knowledge is here. It's just been, so yeah. I may not be explaining this well, but hopefully...
No, I think you are. I can hear lots of rings around there, so I think you are. I think what you're saying, it is resonating. I think you are explaining it well. Okay, Tarah?
I think what is exciting for me personally is the opportunity to learn and to really dig into something, to try to see what it's about, what it's doing. And as a writer, part of that is an internal process, for sure. But I also really think that the space for dialogue and the space for orality, and not just the written word, is really key. And so that's sort of leading me to think about different scales of what arts criticisms could be, different scales and different kinds, I suppose. Like thinking about sitting around the kitchen table and that kind of space, of that kind of like convivial space, that casual space where dialogue is unable to unfold, and how that is a very important space in many of our communities for knowledge transference and sharing. And why can't that be? Well, I don't see, but also then I start to come up against, so if we're envisioning arts criticisms as multivocal and plural, then do we get to a place where the idea of criticism is just not really useful? Like, can we separate it? And maybe now I'm challenging what I said before about being invested in institutions and in the way that these spaces can shift, but is the idea of criticism then something that needs to sort of fundamentally change? So I'm sort of waffling between that in my mind right now. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't think there's any waffling. I think it's, is that not part of what we're maybe trying to do, rather than the linear singularity, right? Maybe we need more space, not for waffle, but for fluidity, perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe that's a good opportunity to open to the floor. So if anyone has questions in specific that they'd like to put to any of the panelists, put your hand up. And I think I've been asked to repeat the questions into the mic so that everyone can hear and so that the recording can pick it up. But equally, if you don't have a question for a panelist, but you want to share a thought on what a model might look like, what your role might be in that, how that might feed into your own practice, then I welcome it. So over to you. Does anyone have anything they would like to share this? Oh, yes. Hello.
Furiously writing over here. Appreciate all this gems on here. To Alana, you talked about responsibility, and it was really refreshing to me because it's something that I grapple with, that I do in my life. And I'm thinking about creation and what we owe people, and in relation to responsibility, the first statement that came to mind was not much. And it was very righteous of you to kind of connect colonialism and this expectation that we have when we are digesting people's art of, I want all the answers. And if I don't get them, then it's, crap or whatever, And I thought that was really refreshing. But then I started thinking about, okay, what does it mean for all of you when you're creating when you encounter vulnerability? Mm-hmm. Because vulnerability can be kind of poisonous when you start thinking about other people's opinions. Mm-hmm. And I guess my question is, how do you meet vulnerability when it comes up? Right. And how do you stay firm in what it is that you're creating? Keeping in mind that you don't owe people much. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And again, thank you for that point about responsibility. That was really refreshing.
Okay, hold on, Elena. I can't repeat the whole thing. But just for the sake of archives and recordings, the question at the end, thank you for that very beautiful and eloquent question, by the way, and for your thoughts. So how do you meet vulnerability and stay, okay, I can't even read my own writing. So did you grasp the whole question? How do you meet vulnerability and stay, what was the last bit? And stay firm. Stay firm in what you're creating. Thank you, I can read firm. Okay, Elena.
That's great. It's a really good question, especially I think like in the academy, it's such a hostile, dehumanizing space that it's something that I continuously struggle with, right? And so for me, I think what's allowed me to remain grounded throughout and be able to be vulnerable, especially because I feel like sometimes grad school just kind of rips you apart and then it's like, I want more, is remembering that I am attempting to change the space there so that anyone who wants to come behind me can, and that this space will look different. And to me, that requires a level of vulnerability. So one of the things I've done, for example, is with my supervisors and my committee, is I've been very open about the different struggles that I've had about different things. So maybe, providing a more of an emotional context of what I'm processing in regards to helping them learn to what it might actually look like, right, to be an Indigenous student in the academy. Because as I said, I'll be the first Native to graduate from my program, the PhD program, and then the department. So there's a lot of learning for them to do. And, that's, I think, for me, where I push for vulnerability, is allowing it to not only teach me, but then to teach others, to reach others, and just working to have that trust in myself and what I'm putting out there and why. And with my own, poetry, my written work, and all my other things, it's the same thing. I think for me, one of the main things in my life that I'm always striving for is healing, and wanting to be able to provide what I have found through the work of others that have helped me to heal, that have helped me to understand or see myself, because there's very few places in the academy where I actually see myself, and that includes intellectually, but also vulnerable, with the vulnerability. And that's where I found solace in these spaces that poets and artists have created for me. And so it's wanting to create spaces like that to continue that. And then, with regards to responsibility, I'm always just like, what about all these expectations of people? And then I'm trying to flip that and say, well, what expectations do I have of my audience, of the people who are going to be interacting, looking at my work, whether that's written or painting, right? And being able to say, I get to have expectations of that audience, right? To flip that on its head and say, what, if you want to fully understand this, then read these 10 things, or just trying to create it so that people are okay with it if they only take away a small thing and no answers, because that's how I start my dissertation. I don't have any answers for you, and trying to be unapologetically doing that. So thank you for your question.
Thank you. That was a beautiful answer. Anyone else? Serena.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. I'm Serena. I was one of the speakers at the first.
Do you want to just use the mic?
I mean,
sorry.
Yeah, that's helpful. Sure. Will it reach? I just don't want to. Okay, cool. Hi, I'm Serena. I was one of the speakers at the first event, and I just wanted to say, how much I appreciate being able to hear you all at this event too, and really connecting with what you're sharing about legibility. I think I stepped out for just the beginning of that conversation, so I hope that this wasn't covered at all, but I'm really fascinated to think about what the intersection is between legibility and audience. Audience. And then also thinking about what you're sharing about teaching and having, being the first, Indigenous, PhD student in the English department at UVic, which is not surprising, but also is, power to you. And I think about my own identity as a trans woman and how I feel like in my own work, I'm expected to be, an advocate for my identity and for people with my identity. And at the same time, I want to push back on that. I want to be able to just exist as a writer and as an artist, and just as my writing exist and be legible on its own merit, as opposed to being able to teach people about what being trans is, and to teach people, we should be included and we should be represented. I guess I'm trying to, at the last event discussion, I shared, I think, just saying that someone asked, I think, who our intended audience was for our creative practice, and I said, my audience is myself, and it's people like me, and, I think that's true, and at the same time, how much do I question that, I guess, at the same time when, I see in the media that, all the capitalistic kind of successes are really based around works that are, understandable and legible. And I don't know, I guess I'm struggling really to balance the idea that I want to just have my work exist with the idea that in order to be successful, I need to be able to be understood and accepted and tolerated. Yeah, I don't know. It's rough, but I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts on that kind of push-pull balance. Yeah.
I just feel like, and I'm speaking as an admirer of artists like yourself, because I'm, as a curator, I feel much more like a facilitator, but the things that you're putting out into the world, that is such a generous offering of you to make that and to share it, because that is such a vulnerable position to be in. And I don't have any other any other advice, but just to say that this that is so profound that you are able to make something and to share it in the world. And I feel like the acts of writing and of producing visual art, and these can be acts of creating community around what you're doing. And I feel like that is what so much practice is doing, right? Is making those connections with other people, with other ideas. None of us are creating in a vacuum, right? So, yeah, I don't know. Thank you.
Can I respond a little bit? Because as a writer, I have sort of two practices, as in art history, art writing, art criticism, and then I have, since finishing my PhD, which took 9 years, then I finally finished writing it, and then I finally felt free to start writing something else that I hadn't logistically had the time or the mental energy for, which is creative nonfiction. And there's sort of quite different practices because the approaches are so different, and I'm trying to bring the two together, and yet my publisher's really resistant, because in the art history they want the authoritative voice, they want the expert, and I'm trying to say I don't feel comfortable being that. Is there a way of opening up pluralities and vulnerability in the writer of the art historian, to say that I don't have all the answers? Can we go into it from that point? It's a conversation ongoing at the moment. And then I've realized as well, since moving into this practice of creative nonfiction, that for the first 15 years that I was writing and publishing, I was always writing about other people's art. And in a way, I think I was shielding myself a little bit, because I could write, but I would be writing about someone else's ideas, and it requires a great deal of vulnerability and willing to risk to not hide behind other people's artwork anymore. So that's my thoughts on that.
Okay, awesome. Great. Actually, I think that, I say it's really funny to end up as an academic, and I think that's actually partly why, because, if you notice on here, the poems I shared are love poems. So some of the things I love writing most are short love poems. And unless I was to qualify them as Indigenous, possibly change them to add some kind of indigeneity, they're not going to be marketable, right? Whereas I'm I just want to publish a collection of love poems, and I happen to be Indigenous, right? So, for me, it's sometimes I'm creating things where it's in my other areas of my life, I might be solid decolonization, indigeneity and all that. But in my creative work, sometimes I just want to create a space to exist just as me, to just share one part of myself, that while I am all these things, I don't feel like I need to be, push the same way I am in other areas of my life. So that's also another part of my dissertation, is when looking at indigeneity through literary criticism and some, other aspects of Indigenous scholarship, how are we creating a new standard for what qualifies someone to be Indigenous? Exactly, right? So needing to be X, Y, and Z, and then, you're marketable, then we can bring you into talk, right? So then it's creating creating this new standard, this, thing that I feel like I need to fit into in order to be able to achieve some of the things that I want to, right? And so I'm asking why we're creating these things, right? And especially too, I think it helps people to be able to feel like they can understand something by having these labels or something. I'm not exactly sure, but it's something that I'm looking at because it's always on my mind, right? Why, and how the market plays a role in that now, and what's published, whose voice is heard, whose voice is accessible, right? So how can we create other spaces for voices to exist that don't need to be super one thing in order to be able to be sold, right? To be able to, read each other's art, because, your poetry is amazing and always hits me in the chest, and I feel like I can't breathe in the best possible way, right? And I love that about it, and so I hear you. It's tough, and I don't have any answers for you, but it's one of the things that I'm looking at because I'm like, why, right? And why, and how can we change that so that, our work can exist the way that we want it to? Yeah.
Yes, Michelle.
Waiting for the conversation to go in a direction where my question could be morphed into something more positive than. Conversation, and I think maybe I'm there. When you listen to this conversation and we hear a discussion that is so much about the potential of creating space for different voices and different narratives and different interpretations. Why is it, do you think, that there is a sector of the arts community that insists on demanding or remaining committed to the single narrative, or the idea of the authoritative voice? I think about that from the perspective of the art museum, but it's interesting to me to hear you, Kemi, talk about your publisher wanting the authoritative voice. Why would a publisher want the definitive book on the Group of Seven? Because that closes off the space for other books on the Group of Seven, which are always going to sell. Like, what is this backlash and insistence on the single narrative and the singular authoritative perspective about?
Okay, thank you, Michelle. So I'm going to repeat the question for the sake of posterity. So why, where have I written it? Why is there a sector of the arts community that limits or insists on holding forth this idea of the single narrative or the authoritative voice? Does anyone want to take it right off the bat? I have like an idea forming, and it's not yet a sentence, but I could start riffing, and then you could. Elena's ready.
I'm like, this is what I do.
We can tell you're still in the academy, like you're still used to supervisors and crits, and like on the spot now. Okay, Elena, why hold on to this single voice?
And thank you guys for the space, because like through the questions, through my fellow panelists here, I learn a lot, right? Like by putting ideas out there, and then how they're engaged with. So I love that. So thank you guys for all that everybody's contributing today. And that's a really good question, because like to me, from what I've come to understand in the academy, is the way that your own Western knowledge is set. There needs to be a hierarchy, right, in order to continue to have the illusion of superiority over everything, right? There needs to be that authoritative voice to maintain that control, and that's how we're all educated in the Western education system, right, through those similar hierarchies. And so then, is how we're educated to think, create, and then consume, right? And so I think for a lot of people, when we talk about decolonization, anti-racism, anti-oppression, is because it's so embedded deeply inside of us, it requires a lot of self-work too. So which can, require people to reconstruct their identities, because the foundation of how they've come to know themselves is from these colonial influences, right? Myself included, because I went to native school, but also had to go to white school. So, that's my own work. But to me, that's what I've come to understand that as. And so when I talk about decentering whiteness, even I don't know what that looks like beyond that, right? If we're to decenter whiteness, what does that look like? And then when, things are often, replaced, we reproduce some of these logics. So a new hierarchy is created, even if it decenters whiteness, it might not fully do that, right? So to me, that's just what I guess I come to find is people come to rely on what they know. So people spend their whole careers getting educated in one way, and then you come along and be like, well, let's talk about it a completely different way, right? So a lot of the, internal, funding policies and things like that require these specific things in order to be eligible for funding as well. So I think it's a multi-tiered question with how people at multiple levels understand that and how we know how to engage with them. And I think that we need to be able to help prepare people in all levels of that to be able to begin to let go of that need for structure and provide resources in moving away from that and other possibilities, because it is a big thing. It is a lot of work. That'd be my answer to that.
I mean, if I was thinking about the question historically and in relationship to the history of art criticism, right, and the formation of art criticism, and its connections to the history of rationalism and the idea that there is a need for a standard by which things can be measured against. And the way that becomes the thing within the academy that is tested and argued against from these very strident kind of positions. Proven, yes, yeah. Anyway, I don't have anything else to say. Just thinking about that.
I think it really your answer is so eloquent. It just resonates with how deeply seated these beliefs are, that the idea of challenging the singular narrative it gets at this belief system that we don't, or I don't even realize I carry, and that the publisher doesn't realize they carry, and it sort of shakes and unsettles the whole foundation on which they operate. It's not simply enough to, like we all know, to plug in a certain artist. It's the whole way. It's all these lenses being removed and revealed in how we're engaging with and thinking about and writing about the work, and then how that then affects the lenses that we then carry forward. Yeah, okay. Any more questions? Charles.
Thank you for really...
No, okay, I'll repeat. Okay.
First, thank you for a really, really interesting conversation. I think one of the things I was sort of hearing is this, is a reluctance to sort of engage in the idea of criticism as capital C, and maybe it kind of partially goes along with that sort of, it's two things you always have to avoid as Black, brown, and Indigenous people. One is replicating the power structures that exist, and the other one is actually giving away your own power. And so I guess my question is, how do we avoid doing the latter without replicating the former? And I guess I'm thinking of the times when I consciously get together with my POC friends, and the conversations and dialogues we can have amongst ourselves, and creating a common language and an understanding that validates our own perspectives and differences within that context, which is not a sort of a white-centered space. And I guess I kind of advocating, in a way, for a kind of criticism, for one that actually is willing to fully engage with our work, but a little bit more on our own terms, and a little bit less for. I think there's an assumption almost when the term criticism is used that we're using that it's for the neutral audience, which is the white audience, right? And when you close the doors of the gallery
Okay, so can we envisage a criticism that doesn't shy away from power, but that is perhaps specific? Can we? Kemi, can we? Think about that question.
Well, I mean, like, I think that it already exists, maybe, in some forms. And I mean, I think that I have read criticism like that. Like, I think about someone like David Garneau, a lot of his writing, which I think puts forward ideas about what Indigenous art is, and then sort of tests those ideas against artistic practices. I think that's that kind of a space. You know, what is it that is unique about this form? So yeah, I feel like it's totally possible, and I think that's one example of someone that I would look to who's doing that.
I guess I kind of think of it from the sort of Black British and Asian British context. Like, I think of Innova, and which is the Institution of International Visual Arts in London, which was sort of, how did it run initially? Was it a funding body? It was a charity for a while, and then it had its own space and its own programming as well, and an archive and a collection and a library within it, all of which was sort of fostering, supporting, and recording work, whether visual or written, made by artists who were Black and Asian and living and working in Britain. And I think also of like the work of like the Autolith group, like Kojo Eshin and Anjali Saga, and Anjali's original project, one of her earliest projects, was this like email newsletter called Multitudes. It was kind of like in a pre-bloggy era, and in ways of having channels of conversation and discourse that were almost circumnavigating the main, maybe, and the way in which they work, you know, has a very kitchen. I really like the kitchen table image that Tarah brought up earlier, and like the way that Anjali and Kojo do work often involves a very international group, changing it many times, that is centered around a kitchen table. Like, she happens to be a trained chef from her earlier career, you know, and so yeah, I think it makes me think of practices like that. Yeah. Any thoughts?
I don't have a specific answer for you, nor do I think that that's what you're looking for or is possible. But there was very much something that you said that resonated when you talk about not wanting to replicate the same power structures, but then at the same time, like, you recognize the importance of not completely, the way that you worded it, like giving up your power.
Yeah, not shying away from power.
Yeah,
maybe, I think.
like, and I'm wondering, is what you're talking about like a shared kind of, like, ways of sharing or ways of?
I think partially, it's like recognizing that there is a validity to the, well, it might be publishing, it might be other ways of communicating, but like kind of collective communication around a particular topic you mentioned, and the work it's done, and I think you have Caribbean writers, just like Henry Brisson, who talk about multiplicity, there's Stuart Hall, there's all of these figures actually that do kind of exist, yet still, but I kind of find it's funny that they've been invisible from this conversation, and the visible kind of idea of criticism has been this Western notion of criticism, which kind of continually faces that stuff, and I just wanted to kind of bring that stuff into the room and say, actually, that stuff exists, and is something, it's a touchstone that we can use. It's not, it's not the authoritative text, and it's actually often moving against the authoritative text, but there is a body of knowledge out there that's continually kind of being built, and let's kind of not pretend that we're doing it for the first time. Let's sort of say that actually, no, we're moving with something that's actually bigger and global and is relevant to a whole lot of people.
Yeah. It's interesting as well. I find
actually the majority of the world.
interesting and a bit disorienting as well to having like lived and worked in London. Well, like so Punjabi father, born in what became Pakistan, right? Then growing up in England, and then born in England, growing up here, then working in England. And I started out working in Arts Council England funding, in what is deemed by Arts Council as Black and minority ethnic funding, like diversity funding, before I began curatorial work. And so I find it disorienting moving between the two, like having lived and worked there for 15 years and then being here now for 2 years, and only having grown up here but having no professional experience here before. So it's the Caribbean British, Asian British, Black British context in which I have previously placed my knowledge of sort of post-colonialism, and yet living and working here, coming here and looking back, there's zero awareness within contemporary art in London of decolonization and what the space might be between the two, because there's certainly a relationship, but little dialogue or awareness between the two. And I found it I feel like I've jumped from one to another, and it's a good point, like how to carry it through. Chris, you had a question?
No.
A comment.
Well, maybe it's kind of a response to what Michelle and Charles are talking about. Underlying Michelle's question is the maintenance and exercise of power in the art world. That's the answer to why people don't want to give it up. And after 40 years of thinking about this and being acquainted with the various discourses, it's like, power is intoxicating. People love power across cultures, across history. So the question always that never gets answered, and maybe it's unanswerable, is why would anybody ever give up power? If you're sitting in that dialectic that you're talking about, and you're controlling the discourse, and that's the moment we live in history right now. That's the moment we're in. All of the subalterns and others of history are speaking, and they're speaking louder and louder every day, and other people are trying to suppress this. That's where we are. That's why we have all this anti-POC, anti-LGBT, anti-immigrant dialogue in the world today. So we have to amplify the voices that are speaking against that construction of power. But I wanted to just say one thing about a couple of things that all of you mentioned about legibility and translation, and bring back to this idea that Tarah was talking about multivocality. Charles and I use the term polyvocality, and it's obviously important to have voices, different voices speaking. And Charles has taught me, and other indigenous people have taught me about the question of orality, and poly-orality, arising not just from indigenous traditions, but many traditions of the world. And what we're starting to try to understand right now is so you have poly-orality like this, but you have poly-orality, A-U-R-A-L, multiple listening, and educating yourself to be able to listen in different frameworks. Now, we have that in Canada with this so-called bullshit multiculturalism. But multiculturalism, as we all know, is very, very lazy. Because what it means is, I had Thai food last night and my neighbor's black. So it's clearly not enough. And in order to decenter whiteness, we talked about you talked about, this idea of decentering whiteness and what is the responsibility of an individual artist, or in the case, Tarah, you were talking about Yumi's work, of the curator, to make things legible. What is the responsibility? What I would say is, what is the responsibility? The responsibility is one of the 5 R's, by the way. Responsibility of the audience members to educate themselves and to become literate in more than one discursive frame around art criticisms, plural, arts criticisms, plural. If you don't live in Canada, and if you're going to be serious about multiculturalism, well, the first thing you have to look at is indigenous people and what their frame is. If you don't do that, you're like illegitimate in this country, in my view. So let's start there, and then when we get a sense of that, then we can talk about the Eurocentric tradition, then we can talk about what does black arts mean in Canada. And there are people doing this, as Charles said. That we're not inventing it for the first time. There's people all across this country researching, writing, and helping to develop these discursive frames. So if you want to understand arts practice, educate yourself. That's my little 2-bit rant.
Yes, exactly. Can I respond?
Yeah, definitely. I can't repeat it, so you can respond.
No, thank you for that, because I think that, you've been able to vocalize, make these connections, and just kind of come out and state them exactly as, what's been kind of building towards that, because it's absolutely true, like, there's been generations and generations of writers of color writing for a really, really, really long time, in this part of colonization and white supremacy that we don't know about it, in a widespread way, right? And I think, going back to your question as well, one of the, things I've witnessed here in Victoria, for example, is the creation of communities of color doing different things. Just operating outside of institutions, outside of organizations, or creating organizations that didn't already exist, So to me, that's one of the ways I feel like coming together with people of color, you're keeping your power, creating power, and, trying to create different power dynamics within those new spaces, right? And so to me, one of those things that has been a really beautiful thing is allowing us to educate each other. Like I said, as I grew up in Port Alberni, which is a little racist hick town, and so through that, I was able to learn more about the Chinese history and, a few other, people who I've met along the way here in Victoria that I didn't know about, right? Like there's a place in Port Alberni called China Creek, and I was never ever educated to know that that was actually named after the Chinese who lived there, right? And, why they were there and the history that happened there. So to me, that was one of the things that came to me. So the way I see that is being able to, be a part of communities of color is being able to, learn from one another in new ways, in ways that we're not going to get from anybody else, right? And that also includes then learning about writers that I might not have known about, right? Critics, different people who have been working, right? And then being able to, because I will be in a position of power to create syllabi, putting them on there, right? Like in my dissertation, the only time I have a white person in my entire dissertation is within one anthology, and that's because it was co-written with an Indigenous person, right? But it's making that conscious choice to do that, right? So things like that I feel like are going to be within my realm of power, being able to use that and switch those power structures, and as Serena was talking about, with regards to the market, there's a Native writer, Lee Miracle, and I think it's her Conversations with Canadians book, I can't remember which one anyway, she talks about one of the ways that she feels like it's creating a market. If it doesn't exist, then she says, for example, like Native band councils, why don't they buy all of these Native books, right? Why don't they buy all of these things, create libraries, or, organizations could be buying books of writers of color. So it's creating that market so that they can therefore be published and distributed widely than they wouldn't have before. So yeah, I really appreciate, your guys' words and all of those things, and yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I think everyone's been sitting for a fair amount of time. Everyone's welcome to stay. There are snacks, there is a survey, there's more discussion to be had that maybe you don't want to have within the larger circle, but perhaps within smaller circles. And Elena, you just led me in beautifully to the final sort of ultimate question that we can wrap up with, which is this idea of book recommendations. So there's obviously like a huge a library full of material that one could read on these issues. So I thought we thought we'd wrap it up with everyone kind of suggesting one text or book or podcast or whatever that they've found particularly informative in this process to share with the group, and then we'll finish up from there. I'll go first. So last time I recommended Heartberries by Therese Mayat, which just blew my mind. And then I thought I can't recommend the same thing twice, even though I would. And you know what? It's so awesome. Like, if you haven't read it, let me know. And I feel like I want to just give 2 copies to people. But before I was a critic, I was a human being by Amy Fung is relatively new. And this is this amazing book by someone who I wasn't aware of, but who was a national art critic in Canada, still writes internationally art criticism. And this book is essentially, the way I read it, as a sort of book-length land acknowledgement that explores the experience of someone who is born in Hong Kong and then grows up in a sort of border of Treaty 6, Treaty 7 territory in Alberta, and kind of reconciles with this myth of, or grapples with this myth of multiculturalism in Canada, Indigenous contemporary artists, and how you live and write and work amongst that. I mean, it's a fast read. I read it in like 2 days in Parksville. It was great. So that's my recommendation. Kemi?
The book that keeps coming to mind, not that there aren't millions of books, but is a book called White Girls from Hilton Alls. What I appreciate about the way that the book unfolds is it's a series of both real and fictitious narratives where this person is embodying these different characters, these different, and uses the idea of performing whiteness and performing femininity to speak about racialization and his experiences. So, yeah, but
okay.
it's brilliant.
Great writer. Do you follow his Instagram?
No.
He has the most amazing Instagram feed that is just Polaroids of the amazing people. He knows everyone. His Instagram feed is really worth also checking out. Okay, Elena?
Okay, I was just double checking the last name once I had my phone. So I had two. The one I mentioned, who's a native scholar called Jordan Abel. I think if you're kind of really looking at, what is considered poetry, he brings in the visual. So on here, that's one of the reasons I ask what is indigenous poetry. So one of them, he went through all of the old Western novels, and anywhere the word Indian is, he's created a poetry book out of that. So I think, if you're really interested in, something that kind of goes beyond what we normally think of poetry, that's a really good one. And then also another one, her name is Jessica Starr. She's really great. She just published her third book, and she's really wonderful.
Thank you.
I recommended 2 essays. So the first one is easily accessible online. It's by Maiko Tanaka. It's published in C Magazine, and I forget the exact title, Citation as a Feminist Practice. And she talks about, in that essay, citation as an artistic methodology, but also she uses it herself within the context of the essay, and thinking about how citation is a way of bringing, the way she puts it, bringing communities performatively into being through citing them. So thinking about how we build these communities of knowledge. And then the other one is an interview between Nancy Chen and Trinity Minha from 1992 called Speaking Alongside, which really challenges, I think, Trinity Minha is talking about her film practice and about the difficulty in or what happens when you describe something directly. You kill it, is the kind of the premise of the text and the conversation that unfolds, which I think poses a lot of interesting challenges to how we think about arts criticisms. So.
Okay, right, now I gotta go read some more. Okay, all right, so there are snacks, there are surveys. You're all welcome to stay and share and discuss, and what could be better than snacks and surveys? But please, please join me in thanking these 3 amazing speakers for being. And thank you also to Reagan and to Rance for all of their organization, and Selena, all of your organization for putting everything on, and Michelle for hosting us here. So thank you to all of you. And yes, so surveys and snacks. Thank you.